guest this evening is Jason Jarrell, and Jason's been on the show before. It's always a pleasure to have him on. Let me read you his bio. Jason Jarrell is an investigative historian who has been studying prehistoric civilizations, anomalism, biblical and extra-biblical texts, and mythology for 18 years. For the last 7 years, he and his wife Sarah have been involved in a project which began as an independent investigation of prehistoric cultures in the Northeastern United States and the Ohio River Valley. Over time, this has evolved into a reassessment of world archaeology and thousands of years of prehistory. Their articles have appeared in Ancient American, Alternative Perceptions, and Opthink magazines, as well as on the Ancient Origins and Road to Ruins websites. They also appear in the Road to Ruins Alternative History documentary series. In 2015, they collaborated with Ross Hamilton on the new edition of his classic book, A Tradition of Giants. Jason and Sarah also write about archaeopolitics, a new field of literature which seeks to restore political awareness in the present of literature. And let's see, did I just skip that? No, let me see. Oh, in the present day, by examining the rise and fall of civilizations past. In 2016, they will be publishing a book with a new theory of 7,000 years of world history, which restores an ancient race of gigantic beings to a prehistoric cultural continuum long hidden by the establishment. And his website is AlleghenyMounds.com. Please welcome Jason to the show tonight. Hello, Jason.
Hello. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on board with us tonight. You're just a wellspring of data when it comes down to this archaeology, and I appreciate your work. So let everybody know, what are you working on? What have you been up to?
Well, we have a lot going on right now. We just got back from a presentation we did at the Solstice event at the Serpent Mound, and we're hard at work on several articles and some archaeological sites that we're investigating to try to put back on the map. And as usual, we're still working on this massive book.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Wow. And I bet the Serpent Mound was quite awesome, huh?
Well, it was my first visit to the Serpent Mound. I'd been to many other earthwork sites, but it was a real experience for me personally, because we got to meet several people like Jeff Wilson and Ross Hamilton and Marcia K. Moore in person, who we'd worked with on several projects in the past. And it was also my first public presentation. And we actually revealed a life-size printout of a recreation of an Adena giant.
Nice.
During the presentation. So it was really interesting to experience people's reactions to that in person. It was recreated from actual skeletal remains and measurements, and photographs of an actual Adena skull from the Wright Mounds in Kentucky. So it's pretty close to what these ancient people actually looked like.
That's really amazing. And of course, people can access this, and Marcia does a phenomenal job with the reconstruction. And of course, I think that's, what's the name of her website where people can actually look at that and view it?
theartofmarciakmore.com.
Okay,
it's
great.
CMR Studios. And Marcia is actually recreating several individuals from different time periods to illustrate our book with. She's really a full-time collaborator, so I highly recommend people check her out.
Oh, absolutely. Well, she's been on the show before, and of course, I'm going to get all three of you back over. I would like to get you back on hyperspace. We talked about that off air a little bit in the fall or something. So yeah, or around towards December. But yes, definitely. And everybody, please check that out, because I can't believe the reconstruction she's done. It's phenomenal. She's done an incredible job. I do suspect the audience was probably shocked, huh?
They were surprised. Some people felt like the large Adena resemble ancient Egyptians. Some people saw very large First Nations and Native American. So it really depends upon your perspective. And it's really not my job to tell someone what to believe. It's just my job to share raw information, because we feel like this knowledge and this research is very important, and it will probably be important to different people for different reasons, and it's up to them to decide what they think about it.
Oh, I agree. Well, it's a historical benchmark for one. And secondly, when have you ever seen any reconstructions such as this? I don't believe I've ever seen anybody do what Marcia has done. And the work that you're doing, this is an uncovering that really needs to be seen by a lot of people. And you're right, it's how they digest the data, but you're actually giving them a credible benchmark, which is a start. And that's very important.
Well, it's interesting that over the years, Marcia herself was asked to do recreations of various anomalous type crania from around the world, including the Paracas skulls, for which she's probably best known.
Mm-hmm.
But over the decades, no one had really attempted to accurately recreate the appearance of one of these North American giants. And that was something that we set out to remedy with our partnership with her.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And we're going to get into the giants later on, but I want to kind of give you the floor insofar as what you'd like to address first. I know we're going to freestyle a little bit of this data, then we'll ask some other questions, but what would you like to start with tonight?
Well, we could start with the 4th of July, actually.
Okay.
Because I often wonder how many people actually understand what the 4th of July really means.
Mm-hmm.
Because it isn't very common in human history that a people actually succeed in throwing off the ruling class, the ruling elite. Because the elite have been with us for a very long time. In fact, we recently published an article about the similarities between modern America and ancient Uruk. And for people who don't know, ancient Uruk today is looked upon as probably the earliest major civilization. It's known for its settlement pattern, its vast urbanism, and many of the innovations of ancient Uruk, including, supposedly, the first widely disseminated form of writing in cuneiform. But what's really interesting about ancient Uruk is that between 3800 and 3100 BC, ancient Uruk began a radical expansion. And this expansion reached into southern Europe and all the way into the western Mediterranean. It was in Iran, the Caucasus Mountains, Syria, Turkey, and possibly even Spain. And they created an empire. And this empire was not built solely upon military or brute force, but rather this empire was built upon economic exploitation, because the priesthood of Uruk had not invented writing to record the deeds of the gods or their great heroes, but rather they had disseminated writing to keep track of the debt of their population. Ancient Uruk ran on a debt-based economy. And so sacred was this debt that their temple was the bank. And that just reminds me a lot of where we are today as we approach the 4th of July, which is supposed to be our day of national sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Because today, we are a debt-based society, and we ourselves are involved in endless wars of aggression for the expansion of empire, just as were the people of ancient Uruk.
Mm-hmm.
In 3100 BC, the Uruk Empire collapsed. Their outposts and their cities were deserted or burned, and entire swaths of the population of the ancient East vanished very quickly. We still don't know what happened to many of them. And I believe that it is the duty of people like yourself and people like us and the people listening to this show today, it is our duty to make sure that our civilization does not vanish as the civilization of ancient Uruk did.
Mm-hmm.
It's our duty to change the course of history by changing the minds and the hearts of the population.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. It's well said. And we are doing it, actually. Slowly but surely, we're chipping away at this illusion and bringing it all forward, hopefully, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, we are. And, I was really proud of the people in Britain for electing to escape from the clutches of the European Union.
Me too. I was so excited to see that. Yep. Yep. That's the first start, is taking your power back step by step from these cabals. And EU is just completely an abomination, if you ask me. So, yeah, it's good to see all this moving. It's all being revealed. All is being revealed right now. And we're breaking away all these layers and going forward. So, and the work you're doing is phenomenal, Jason. I really like the way you communicate. You're just a phenomenal being, and you and Sarah both. What a nice combination and good people, good souls that we have here on the timeline. So I do want to thank you for that. I thought I saw a question in chat, and I'll have to go back and look because this thing moves so quickly. But yeah, I think they were asking how old the skeletons were, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that's an excellent question. I love to talk archaeology. The skeletons that were used, I'm assuming that's for the recreation that we did. The skeleton that was used in terms of the measurement and size was measured by an agent of the Smithsonian in 1883 from a burial mound in West Virginia. And that mound was probably built somewhere between 400 and 200 BC. The skull that was used for the recreation was from an individual who probably lived sometime between 100 BC and 100 AD. But a review of the anthropology of the Ohio River Valley, as it's been studied for the last few decades, tells us that the unique physical type of the Adena people was actually present in the Ohio Valley at least as early as 1400 BC, because individuals with their unique craniofacial features and skull shape were found at an archaic site called the Berry Hill Cemetery in Ohio. And recently I did an independent review of the artifacts from several mounds in the Ohio Valley and found at least 5 or 6 which probably were begun in the late Archaic period before 1000 BC and then continually built up over the next few hundred years. So while the skeletal remains date to about the mid first millennium BC for the reconstruction, the type of individual that is represented in the Adena people was present in North America between 2000 and 1000 BC also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really amazing, isn't it? It's very, very old. There's no doubt about that one. And of course, the history behind it, we still don't really know a lot of that history, although you're encoding quite a bit. And what is the response from the majority of mainstream people in this field? Do they give you any credit or credibility, or?
Well, that usually depends. A lot of people run into our research and our work because maybe they've heard one interview or read one article. The academics often respond favorably as long as they only see the part of our research that is mainstream, but usually when they learn about our research with the tall ones with the unique physical types, that's when they give us some grief.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had an archaeologist explain to me that while several of the large skeletons that have been measured by professionals were indeed very large individuals and the measurements are accurate, that they just don't feel like it's important. Well, I believe that it's up to every individual person whether or not this information is important. I fail to understand why it is that we have licensed priesthoods in the United States of America who determine what is scientifically valid and what should be important to the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of our missions to sort of pry this ancient information out of academia and to give it to the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you doing that. There's no doubt. We need a lot of revealing, so to speak. Well, it seems to me they've always used some form of control and manipulation, as we were kind of discussing off air, and we can kind of go into the aspect of the quote-unquote Anunnaki, or even perhaps the lineage associated with the giants and Anunnaki and the controlling aspects.
Well, in the ancient world, human beings were not always under the control of an elite. It is a falsehood of the modern era to assume that we've always had an elite class. We have not. In fact, in North America and Europe, during the Neolithic period and the American Middle Archaic period, human beings were getting along quite well and coming together to do extraordinary things for thousands of years before the appearance in the archaeological record of what we call chiefdoms. The chiefdom has not always been with us. For example, in Neolithic Europe, it's now understood that there were actually leveling mechanisms built into society to prevent individuals from exploiting various circumstances to gain power. In North America, between 6000 and 3000 BC, North Americans were creating unbelievable monumental structures such as pyramids and shell mounds, many of which had astrological alignments. They were practicing limited megalithism. They were crafting some of the finest copper artifacts anywhere in the world. In fact, copper artifacts that were superior to those which appeared in Europe at the dawn of the Copper Age. And yet, the archaeologists understand today that these Middle Archaic North Americans were motivated by cosmology. There were no political or economic controls. These people were making their decisions and doing the things they did based on the sheer force of belief.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't until the dawn of the Bronze Age that Europe and also North America begin to be organized in what's called a political economy. As the chiefs emerged after 3000 BC in Central and Western Europe, they began to control essential resources, and they began to organize the first mercenary armies. And the lineages that they founded throughout Europe persisted for thousands of years. And it is from these lineages, possibly, that our ruling class today may descend from. And you mentioned the Anunnaki earlier.
Right.
Well, the Anunnaki, as I understand it, the Anunnaki represents a very early concept of the theory of divine right. And that's the idea that some human beings are special due to some connection that they hold with the divine, and so they deserve to rule over other people. And that's really where the concept of royalty and elitism came from in human history. Well, when the great Sumerian civilization of Uruk collapsed in 3100 BC, the chiefs and the elites that had spread out into different colonies around the east and the Caucasus Mountains migrated into Europe all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and there they founded the chiefly lineages that I mentioned before from the dawn of the Copper Age.
Mm-hmm.
So, as unbelievable as it may sound, there is a historical and archaeological precedent for the history of human power brokers and elite lineages going back to what people refer to as the Anunnaki.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense right there, what you're saying. Looks like we have a question here from Olive. It says, would he say also some of these mounds are west of Pittsburgh in and around Allegheny Country? or county, rather?
I certainly would. The Carnegie, let me put this in perspective. We know very little about the mounds in the Pittsburgh area which held the giants due to the fact that most of those mounds were excavated by the Carnegie Museum. Many of the mounds excavated by the Carnegie Museum were never even reported in an actual full archaeological report. Many of those excavations are moldering in manuscript form in vaults in the Department of Anthropology of the Carnegie Museum. However, the mounds that were excavated around Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania by the Smithsonian did contain occasional large individuals, and some of the mounds which we've researched from Pennsylvania were undeniably Adena mounds, and I would refer the person asking that question to look into the McKees Rocks Mound.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because
go ahead.
There were several large skeletons found in the McKees Rocks Mound. I recently finished a study where I cross-referenced 7 different analyses of the notes of the excavator, and there were multiple large skeletons from that mound, and probably that mound was built up over a period of many hundreds of years, because the more recent burials in that mound had shell-tempered pottery sherds with them, and that's a very recent form of pottery, while the earliest burial, the primary burial in the mound, had late archaic artifacts, possibly going back to before 1000 BC. And what's interesting about the McKees Rocks Mound is several years ago, the First Nations people tried to sue the Carnegie Museum to retrieve the remains that are still left from the mound for reburial under the law. And remarkably, in court, the Carnegie Museum was able to defeat those people on the basis that there are no living descendants of the Adena culture in North America today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly a mound that you'd want to check into if you live in that area.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. That's good information right there. I was going to ask you, are you typing, or what's that noise that's going on? Someone was asking, are you fiddling with something?
It's just me sitting here with my notes.
Okay, it's fine. I don't care. I noticed a few people asked me what it was, and I wasn't sure, but that's okay. We're good. It stopped as soon as I asked you, but you must have been, it's probably the paper going back and forth, which is fine. It's not a big deal. So let me ask you something. I know we kind of discussed a little bit, we kind of went through some talking points off air a little bit, and you wanted to disclose or communicate some research tonight and that you haven't mentioned before. Would you like to do that now?
Yes. Over the years, we've been asked several times if there was ever any evidence of ancient technology discovered from prehistoric cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's probably a common question, you know, that people ask in the types of circles that we walk in. You know, everyone's read these books about the chariots of the gods and everything like that. But first of all, I do not personally believe that there are beings from other worlds visiting Earth today. But I do believe that human beings have done remarkable things in the past. And it may be that human beings who desire power would want to obfuscate knowledge of the past in that regard. So with that, I'd like to talk for a minute about the research of John Burke and Cash Halberg. In the 90s, these two investigated many earthworks, mounds, ancient megalithic sites, and hinges in ancient Europe and North America. And what they found was that these types of sites were overwhelmingly built at locations where local geology magnified naturally occurring electromagnetic fluctuations in the Earth's crust. And in several experiments, they were able to duplicate the purposes of many of these prehistoric earthworks. For example, in August of 1996, they placed seeds of corn and beans at 3 different locations along the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio during a lightning storm. After this lightning storm, these seeds were taken and planted, and they were found to produce a greater yield and to possess a greater growth rate than other seeds from the same batch which were not placed in the mound during the lightning storm, as much as 5 times greater.
Wow. That's impressive.
Now, they performed magnometer surveys at numerous sites, prehistoric sites, and their research concluded that the electrical charge at hingiform structures and the largest surviving burial mounds was among the highest encountered anywhere in nature. And as I said before, they felt that this was due to the locations where these structures were built.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the ancients were harnessing electromagnetic energy, according to this research. And this research, by the way, they've managed to duplicate these experiments around the world at different prehistoric sites.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that in mind, I'd like to point out that the hingiform structures built by the Adena culture in North America, and what I mean by that is a hinge is a circular bank of earth.
Mm-hmm.
It can be anywhere from a few feet to 15 feet high. It usually has an interior or exterior ditch and at least one entryway. The hingiform structures built in North America by the Adena and the Hopewell cultures in the Ohio Valley are identical to similar structures in Western and Central Europe. In fact, the oldest hingiform structure currently known is dated to around 5000 BC in Germany, and it's called the Gothic enclosure. And in Central Europe, some of the other oldest enclosures come from Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Now, what's very interesting is these hingiform enclosures and mounds are now understood by archaeologists to have followed the development of agriculture in world history.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they follow the spread of agriculture from southern Europe up the Baltic, and then the most recent hingiform enclosures are across the sea in Britain and Ireland. That is precisely the pattern of development of prehistoric agriculture in world history. So, it may be that the prehistoric structures, the mounds, and the enclosures and earthworks in North America and Europe had a practical purpose of which we're only now becoming more aware of.
Mm-hmm.
This could have had some type of effect on health, on longevity. It could have had a profound impact on crop yields.
Mm-hmm.
And in that regard, it's very interesting to mention that the Adena culture are known to have had corn. They're known to have harvested squash, pumpkin, and several other crops. But the other dimension of this is that essentially what we're talking about is what could possibly be a form of organic technology. A form of technology which works in harmony with the environment rather than against it, as most of the technology and the energy sources we have today indeed do. And the question becomes, did anyone else ever find out about this?
Right.
So, with that, I'd like to go to a profile of J.W. Powell. J.W. Powell, in 1879, became the director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology. And the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian oversaw in the 1880s the massive series of mound and enclosure investigations undertaken by the Smithsonian throughout the Ohio Valley and more or less the entirety of eastern North America. There were multiple hundreds of mounds and earthworks pillaged and destroyed at this time period, including the ones here in Charleston where I now live. And while this is well known, this part of Powell's career is well known, what is less known is that J.W. Powell was a little-known philosopher and Darwinian. In fact, he was a neo-Lamarckian Darwinian, and these types of philosophers believed that mankind could unleash a golden age and trigger his own evolution to a higher state through science. In other words, Powell was an early transhumanist. So, in 1878, a year before he had taken control of the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian and overseen the excavation of countless hundreds of prehistoric sites, Powell formed a secret society called the Cosmos Club. Now, the Cosmos Club originally functioned in a manner similar to a Masonic lodge. They did not allow female members, and their membership rituals were steeped in the occult. And the stated goal of the Cosmos Club was to promote its members in the advancement of science. Over the years, members of the Cosmos Club have included virtually every major luminary in science and politics, including Woodrow Wilson, Alexander Graham Bell, Herbert Hoover, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rockefellers, and arch-globalist Henry Kissinger. So this is obviously an important organization. And I would like to also add that many members of the Cosmos Club over the years have also been members of the Bohemian Grove Society. And one prominent member of the Cosmos Club was none other than Vannevar Bush. Now, Vannevar Bush was the co-founder of Raytheon. And in 1939, he became the head of the Carnegie Institute of Washington and the American Eugenics Society. When he became chairman of the National Defense Research Committee of the United States government, Vannevar Bush headed up a program to apply advanced electromagnetic warfare to the battlefield.
Well, what year was that?
This is in the 1940s.
Interesting, okay.
Now, originally, Raytheon, which Vannevar founded, was named the American Appliance Company. And its original stated purpose was to develop electronics. The first product of the American Appliance Company was a helium rectifier based on astronomical research of the stars, and that is where Raytheon got its name, Light from the Gods. Conveniently, Vannevar Bush, the head of the American Eugenics Society, the champion of electromagnetic warfare, also invented the microwave oven and helped to get it placed in every home in the United States. He was also behind the early designs for the computer, and he was the organizer of the Manhattan Project, which produced the atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have an instance, a possible instance of technology or technological development which may have begun from discoveries from ancient prehistoric sites.
Mm-hmm.
It's also worth mentioning that while Vannevar Bush was the head of the American Eugenics Society at the Carnegie Institute, he changed the policy of the American Eugenics Society from one which sought to weed out certain families, lineages, and races to one which represented a full-blown war against the population. He advocated experiments in electronics and mass birth control to obtain these ends. And there's an interesting book called The Endless Frontier by Pascal Zachary, which documents the fact that Bush was an advocate of a scientific dictatorship, which he called the technocracy. In the 1950s, Bush openly called for the natural aristocracy of humanity to begin using media to govern the opinions, values, and politics of what he referred to as the blind mass. So, the question is, how blind are we?
Mm-hmm. Very, very well said. I must say you're incredible. And yeah, well, that's the whole idea behind it, isn't it? It's about control, manipulation, and cloaking data. But that's interesting about this harnessing of the electromagnetic energies, and I tend to agree with you on that one. Now, how does Tesla fit into any of this, if at all? He wasn't affiliated with any of these organizations, right?
Nikola Tesla, as far as I know, was genuinely searching for ways to improve the lot of the common person through technology. But I believe that his downfall came when he began to take funding from elite families.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that when Tesla died, the government raided his home, and from what I understand, they actually even confiscated his body.
Right. Oh, really? Interesting. Well, you know that DNA is worth a lot. And chances are he was a hybrid of some kind anyway.
Well, unless you were born after 1978, in which case they took a sample of your blood against your will and without the knowledge of your family immediately after you were born, and they would still have your DNA. So
that's after 1978 when they. Oh, okay.
yeah.
So I thought it was earlier than that, or maybe not. Interesting. Wow, this is very, very fascinating information. I'll tell you what. And it kind of reminds me of, when the ancients were harnessing this electromagnetic energy, how do you think they learned this? Do you think they were taught this by some advanced culture, or do you think it's in their cellular memory, intuition, or what do you think created that?
I believe that combining the realization that the ancients had these capabilities with some anthropology and some known prehistory can reveal a lot to us. One thing that it can't tell us, not yet at least, is where this knowledge came from. But what it can tell us is where it went.
Mm-hmm.
Because earlier I mentioned that these types of earthworks were spread by the Neolithic people into Central and Western Europe. What we now understand from a prehistoric perspective is that right around 2500 BC, Europe was invaded by another population which completely supplanted the gene types of the earlier Neolithic people, the farmers. And this new people brought with them the concept of chiefdoms. And they continued to use the enclosures, But what's very interesting is that for the first time in history, right around 2000 BC, we start to see burial mounds for prominent, powerful individuals either inside or near these enclosures. So it could be that millennia after this technology was introduced, this organic technology, a new people decided to exploit it and essentially seize control of it. And within a few hundred years, the rest of the population may have come to believe that the elite class were the only ones that could make the technology operate. And this may be one path that was used at the dawn of the Bronze Age to introduce the concept of rank, file, and elitism into the European world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's interesting because they have been using covert technology for, I don't know how long, for a very, very long time. Obviously, this is something that's only accessible by a certain group of beings or people, and of course we have, our covert military, and I don't want to go into that direction, but it's very interesting to me because it is very clear that they are using technological advances that are black technologies to some degree to manipulate the masses. And I think it's very, very significant that we reveal all of this technology and expose it for what it really is and how it's been manipulating everyone.
Well, there's a tendency that people who think outside the box have today to look up when it comes to questions of where the technological explosion is coming from. People tend to want to search for some outside source to explain the technology that we have today, or the technology that they have, that the elites possess. When in reality, we may simply need to look behind us, because it could be that something from our own past has been used to develop the modern world.
I agree. I totally agree with you. You made a really good point also when you look at all the ancient megalithic structures, and I've talked about this before with previous guests, but when you look at all these structures, they're fascinating and yet they're so indigenous to this world. But you never find anything that's really representative of quote unquote an off-world species or some kind of device that really shows a foreign technology that's not from here. And I think that's a very significant thing. Now we could say perhaps it's people like the Smithsonian or other divisions that obviously have hunted for these sacred devices or whatever they are, like Hitler used to do, and confiscate them. But what do you think? What do you think really happened? I know you kind of touched on really it's here. It's the benchmark is in our legacy of where we've been on the timeline as a race, right?
I believe that the benchmark for the best days of our race is in the past. That does not mean that we cannot have a golden age again. In fact, I believe that we're waking up from a dark age right now. But in terms of the ancient enclosures and the prehistoric earthworks, they did not exist at random. The designs were very intentional, and sometimes they recur thousands of years apart. And I can give you a couple examples. Stonehenge 1, for example, was not a stone structure. The original form of Stonehenge was an earth and bank enclosure, a circular enclosure with two entrances, like the ones I described earlier. It was built around 3000 BC. Now, 2,000 years later, the Hallstatt culture at Koblenz, Germany, intentionally seems to have tried to replicate features of Stonehenge 1 at a henge site known as the Gollering Henge. There are several other great examples. For example, in both America and Europe, there are numerous earthen burial mounds, conical burial mounds, surrounded by the same ditch and earthen bank with a singular entryway. And we're currently investigating a site here in North America which may have been designed to replicate one of the earliest Neolithic henges from Slovakia. So these structures were not designed at random. There are recurring themes and designs that seem to persist throughout the millennia, and it may be that they were used for different purposes. Some of the activities which have been suggested for hingiform enclosures include craft specialization areas, villages, ceremonial centers, pan-regional interaction centers, burial sites, and even at Springfield Lions in Europe, it was the location where a local powerful chief chose to build his house inside of one of these large enclosures. So clearly, these were being used to enhance numerous aspects of human life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It looks like there's a question here from Olive again in the chat. It says, Solaris, would guests agree that there are still mystery schools going today that teach us?
Would I agree that there are still mystery schools?
Uh-huh.
Well, we know for a fact that there are mystery schools today. I don't know how much they're actually teaching us, because most of the people who are members don't seem to be very good people. I would say that in your terms, Solaris, they're of the left-hand path. If you look at organizations like the Bohemian Club or Skull and Bones, they're actually no different than the mystery schools of the past. They're set up the same way. Many of their rituals are similar. And in many instances, there seems to have been a very bizarre interest that some of the secret societies had in the discovery of the tall skeletons.
That's not a surprise. Yeah. Well, it's all about DNA. Once again, anything that's kind of an extraterrestrial signature or off-world or unusual to some degree, anomalous, let's put it that way, I would suspect that they would be very interested in. Anything that's going to upgrade them as a race or a species, or maybe give them an extra gift or an ability.
Exactly. Exactly. In fact, if you were to go to archive.org and look up the first annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution, published in 1879, I believe, you'll find a mound excavation in that report in which the excavator openly declares that the individuals buried in the mound were prehistoric Freemasons.
Interesting.
And this is in an actual Smithsonian report. I highly recommend that anyone that's interested in secret societies take a look at that, because not only does the account appear, but a bureau agent offers commentary on the report and basically makes the claim that this is something that every Mason should know.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that. And you guys, I'm not taking calls right this minute, so don't call in. You can call in the next hour. They're all just pushy. Anyways, so there's another question here from Zaphod, or I don't know if I said that right. Question Studio. Okay, so is the guest aware of how the Dogon tribe in Mali had advanced knowledge of quantum physics?
Yes, they were very informed, I believe, as to the scientific data around the star Sirius. I believe that that's what the person refers to. Although I will admit that most of my research is confined to the ancient Middle East, Europe, and North America.
Right. Yeah, it would be nice to see you branch off later on. But I appreciate the work you're doing here, obviously, in America, because that's where we're all located. But yeah, it's fascinating to explore these other areas and the signatures behind where they've been, and the possibilities insofar as how they even acquired some of their technologies. But I still think it's internal. In other words, I think there's this cellular memory. This is just my own take, that there's a cellular memory of recall of what we are as what I call multidimensional beings or star people, whatever you want to say. And I think that we can access that. I believe that's how we just learn, by working with elements, working with nature, working with whatever it is, electromagnetic technology, because we are electromagnetic too. We can't forget that.
Well, our DNA is electromagnetic. DNA communicates information through biophotons.
Yep.
So it's entirely possible that our DNA contains a record of all the experiences of our ancestors. And that's a very scientific concept.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the reason that the giants strike such a powerful chord with people all over the Western world is because they're a part of our genetic memory. Our ancestors all had extensive interactions with these beings, and the reason that we respond to this information on a certain level is the record that's contained in our DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that one too. And there's another thing too, it's not just the DNA of our ancestors, but to me, it's the DNA of our quote unquote off-world star people's ancestry, the celestials, what I call celestial ancestry. I think that's where this interpolation comes in through possible religion. And we can get into this next hour if you want, but I want to go deeper into the giants insofar as how far back they go into the illusion of history, his story, a version of something. And maybe we can touch base on a lot of this also. But there's so much, it's such a complex system, and you're so spot on about the DNA. Acting as the antenna, of course, of being electromagnetic. And the biophoton, that's huge for what we call light body. Anybody who's on the path of spirit understands how the body becomes light, what we call the body of light or the rainbow body. So that's very significant.
Well, DNA is actually the great mystery because it's designed to be perfect. And it's also designed so in such a manner that it can be tampered with. So when we study reports of anomalous beings from the ancient past, we do have to open our minds enough to account for different possibilities regarding origins.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. Yeah, I can tell that you've done your work. That's for darn sure. You're very studious when it comes down to information. And I very much appreciate that. I know a lot of other people do as well.
Well, thanks. You're going to end up making me proud of myself.
You should be proud of yourself. I tell you what, you're awesome. And of course, you do a lot more lecturing now, don't you?
Well, did my.
And Jason, we're